Hello, this is Václav, and today I have something a little bit different to show you, and it is the evolution of the Midi Looper and the 1983, which are two products that deal with MIDI signals that we have released. And just to give you an idea what the design process takes from an early idea to a finished product and how long it can sometimes take to do something I think that's a bit innovative. So if we now see the whole timeline in front of us, we start somewhere, I couldn't find the exact date, but let's say early 2015, which is this prototype. It's like the first one I built just to, be able to connect MIDI to my modular synth. It just has a MIDI input, optocoupler, an Atmega chip, and a DAC converter, which just takes the digital data and makes the voltages. And I think it has a clock output, CV output, and gate output. Just the bare minimum, really. Eurorack power and a programming header. So this was my first thing, just to start to learn how to do things. What came after was this sort of prototype, where I was kind of probably trying to do a bit too much at once. The basic idea was that I'm gonna have 3 channels, not just one, and I'm gonna select a channel by pressing a button, and I'm gonna have probably something like record clear, and I don't know, some button that controls maybe an arpeggiator. I don't even know what everything I've planned. So this was pretty much supposed to be like a MIDI to CV looper / sequencer arpeggiator. There was this sort of like a matrix that I wanted to use for doing like a lot of different selections of modes and so on. So the CV gate for every channel, and there was a clock and reset output as well. So the workflow would be, I have a keyboard connected here. I select the first voice, that maybe is a bass line. I play a few notes, I loop it, then I go to a different voice. I play a few notes on the keyboard, I loop it, and then I have a third voice in the modular. So this was the original sort of concept, what I wanted to do. It was this idea, how do you actually play music on the module that's like not setting an 8-step sequencer or being like overly, being overly like, can't find the right word. Generative, yeah. So you could like basically just play the music on the keyboard, the ideas that come to your mind, and have an interface for that. So it soon kind of became apparent that there are like 2 quite specific tasks to deal with, and also if you look at this interface again, like just try imagine using it. So there are cables connected all the way here. There's this huge MIDI cable hanging, and then you kind of need to press the buttons here on top. So that was the first problem, like it's kind of hard to reach. The better, I think, would be to flip it upside down, to maybe have the buttons as close to you as if you're the keyboard player, and then have the cables going on from the other side, which I think I planned at some point. But what kind of became clear to me is that I want to like take those 2 tasks, doing the MIDI looping and doing the MIDI to CV conversion separately. And I think it turned out to be like very important step. So sometime in 2017, I think that's when this happened. So there's like one road that leads to 1983, which is the MIDI to CV conversion, and then there is this longer road that deals with the looping aspect and leads to the Midilooper that we released in summer this year. So basically the idea was informed by this prototype that like this would be like really hard to play because of all the cables and so on. So then this is the first prototype. It actually was working. I played my first show in early 2017. So I probably built it, I don't know, late 2016. And I played my first show sometime in February 2017 with this. And it was already working. So the main idea from the Midilooper is that you have 3 different channels. You have a record button and a clear button. So those are the buttons that I end up using the most on the Midilooper anyway. But yeah, and then there was like a little display and a button maybe to do some settings for the MIDI channels. MIDI in, MIDI out. I don't know what this switch was for. I think it was to turn off the MIDI input or something. And there were some jacks that I believe were the pedal inputs, so I could control the MIDI looper with my feet. So, and here on top I have one of the early prototypes of the 1983, which I believe is somewhere mid-2017. So this was just MIDI in and 4 channels, CV and gate, and the fourth channel you could either have a reset and clock or have a like 4th channel of CV and gate. So yeah, when I first actually made this one work, the 1983, I actually connected 4 analog oscillators to it. It was already working. I tuned the oscillators, which took maybe like, I don't know, 5 minutes. And then I went to get a coffee, I came back and they were out of tune. So I had to start tuning again. I was like, no, I'm seriously not doing this like again. So then I kind of made an expander, and in the end, this is what format it took from. It became, 2 HP wider, and it had the listen inputs already, so it became what now is the 1983. So 4 channels of CV gate, and each channel has a listen input. So if you're working with the analog oscillators, it can take the raw waveforms, listen to them, and just press the tune button, and it tunes everything for you. It's tuned, and it's tuned in a way that if you play a note C on a MIDI keyboard, it actually plays a note C. And it does a lot of other things, and basically what this project turned into was like, what is tuning and how can you approach tuning? So it has a lot of these like microtonal things, and it's very open in the way how you can configure those outputs. They could be either polyphonic or monophonic. And then there are these creative CV inputs, which kind of the room for them came with including, with making the module a little bigger. So there was room for some inputs. So the update check, which makes the notes update only with a clock impulse to sort of like quantize them in time. The window feature, which I think is like still like really cool to mess with the voice allocation, the transpose input, and the portamento. So that's the road it took for the 1983, and it took another year and a half for this to be a finished product. Like from the point I said I'm not tuning my oscillators again, so it took another year and a half to finish that. So on the Midilooper front, again, this was the early prototype that I had. It was working. I played few shows with it, and I used it mainly for controlling MIDI gear. Then I made a circuit board for it, and it actually had batteries in the beginning, which is a little bit weird thinking about it, because I don't know if you would use the portable setup. So there was like a 9-volt input, MIDI in, MIDI out, and here at the back, and there was a USB as well, I think for power, and these jacks. Yeah, so here came the idea that it's gonna have the analog clock input and reset input, so you would not have to necessarily rely on MIDI clock for looping. Then it has also 2 pedal inputs for the record and clear buttons, but it's pretty much, these two are pretty much the same thing. 4 jacks, 3, 6 buttons, and a little display. It's pretty much the same thing here. Well, then at some point it seemed like it's a little bit difficult to like do everything with just like so few buttons. Like, you know, all these edge cases came to mind, you know. In the end, on the Midilooper, I end up using those buttons the most. But clearly you probably need a few more to get as creative as the Midilooper got. So yeah, then it basically took a whole year to get from here to a version that is just as like few more buttons, and it also has this, like, I think quite important addition of the second MIDI output. So there are 2 MIDI outputs, so you don't need a MIDI through box if you just want to control like 2 devices. It has the analog clock, the analog reset, power input, and what was new here was the play button to basically stop and start the playback again. So this was somehow not possible on the previous prototype, and there was already this transpose button. So the transpose button was here for some of the more creative processing of the recorded material. Kind of funny thing was that there was a switch for the clear button, whether it's clear or erase. So you had to choose with the switch, which now thinking about it, it's kind of dumb. And the switch to change between overdub and overwrite for the recording, which I think is still pretty cool. Yeah, so, and here we have the pedal inputs only for the record and clear, and a metronome output, which here for some reason is with question mark. So yeah. So with this prototype, it was still based on the old 80 mega chip, and it had a RAM chip, like a memory chip, but it somehow became more and more obvious that this chipset cannot run fast enough to read like all the information in one like MIDI clock event to make everything happen real time. So after that, we changed the architecture, which changed the chipset, and we really went hard on defining what it really needs and what it doesn't need. So this is the circuit board. That's one of almost the final one. So then, yeah, it took another year and a half, maybe more, to get to this state. So now I was already working with Lennart and Robert from Dresden, from the Binary Labs. So those guys helped me to design the hardware, and then they designed the software as well, because I felt like my coding skills kind of are hitting the limit. And we had to deal with all the edge case scenarios for how do you handle, I don't know, sustain pedals, and how do you overwrite when you're recording with a sustain pedal, and so on. So there was a lot of decisions to be made, and I turned in this project to be the tester and sort of somebody who needs to make those decisions, but I wasn't coding it anymore. So that was mainly Lennart Schirling who did the coding, and I think it was an excellent choice because he's a brilliant coder. So now when we look at the final one, it's not that far from what we saw in the earlier prototype. There's just like a lot more buttons here on the side, and also I think the layout became a bit more done in a way that you can like navigate it without looking at the device, which was another one of those things that I really wanted. That, you know, the three buttons to select voices are in a row. These are the main buttons, and then like, okay, this is where you reach for the other buttons, and you can just like touch them slightly to know which button is which. And the erase switch became an erase button, so if you want to do erase, there is a dedicated button for that. And I think the biggest change were really the CV inputs, which I'm super glad we have included. So you can either use those jacks for pedal inputs to control the interface of the looper with your feet. So there is the record, clear, and voice selection that you can control with the pedals. But with the interface, you can also redefine them if you're working with a semi-modular environment to be retrigger, velocity control, and transpose. So you get a lot more creative control over what is happening with the recorded MIDI. And there are all these like playback modifiers that actually turned out, I think, something that's in the long run, I think one of the most exciting things about the Midilooper. So setting the length, time stretching, making each track go twice or 4 times slower or faster, the shuffle, the quantization, the locking of the velocity, and the humanize. And the transpose mode with the octave transpose. Then from the back, because we changed the chipset, we could finally do USB MIDI, which is awesome. So if you're working with a computer-based environment, it's a lot easier to connect things. One MIDI out to one MIDI in, 2 MIDI outs, and clock and reset. Another sort of like mini addition that we did is that the clock input could also accept MIDI clock through the mini jack, which I think was like a really great move because you can now use keyboard for looping and a drum machine that gives you a MIDI clock to sync everything. And I think that's really cool because a lot of keyboards cannot just pass the MIDI clock on. So yeah, that just made it like a lot more useful for, I hope, most people. So if you look back at the timeline, now, what is that? Early 2015, mid 2020. It's 5.5 years of development from start to finish. With the 1983, it was a bit faster because it still runs on the 80 mega chipset, and I actually designed that myself. I made all the code myself. Yeah. So this is now being confronted with the time scale. That's just how things are. It feels like I want to thank everybody at Bastl for making this happen, because without having the great people at Bastl, this would not be possible to design at such scale. So for projects like this, that I think bring in a big deal of innovation into how we play music, it really needs those sort of time frames, like half a decade to make them happen. And yeah, also big thanks goes to you, people who support, who buy the stuff that we make, who like what we do. And yeah, thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments if you like this type of content, if you want to see more of that, more sort of thinking about the design of things. And yeah, I'm here at Noise Kitchen, our store in Prague. If you ever happen to be in Prague, come here. My lab is in the back. There are great people working in the store. And yeah, thanks for listening and have a nice day.